The 24th of November, 1989, the day after Thanksgiving. In the small town of Acme, in Whatcom County, Washington, a place where people hardly ever locked their doors, and where a single unfamiliar car was enough to become the talk of the neighborhood before lunchtime. At around 1:50 p.m. that afternoon, an 18-year-old young woman left home, laced up her running shoes, and headed out along the familiar route she ran almost every day. Her only companion was the family's loyal German Shepherd. She never came home. 2 hours later, the dog returned alone. Not with its usual excitement. It was trembling. Its tail was tucked tightly between its legs. And strangest of all, it refused to go anywhere near the road, as though it had witnessed something no living creature should ever have to see. 3 days later, her body was found beneath the waters of the Nooksack River. But this is the detail that haunted the case for nearly 3 decades. The official forensic findings did not conclusively establish her death as a homicide. On paper, it could still have been interpreted as an accident, a reality that sent chills through anyone who learned about the case, because it meant that for a very long time, no one could say with certainty whether investigators were even searching for a killer. The man responsible never left town. For the next 28 years, he continued living in the very same community, driving past the victim's home, sitting down to dinner with relatives, and even building a family of his own. Even more disturbing, at least 2 women quietly suspected the same man over the course of more than 20 years. Yet both kept their suspicions to themselves out of fear, because they had no concrete evidence, and because in a community where everyone knew everyone, accusing the wrong person could destroy a life. It wasn't until a chance afternoon at a water park, when 2 strangers happened to sit beside each other watching their children play, that the secret hidden for more than 2 decades finally began to unravel. And the final clue that exposed the killer? Nothing more than a plastic cup and a soft drink and items he believed he had been careful enough to throw away. Deming is a small community east of the city of Bellingham, in Whatcom County, Washington, a rural landscape of sprawling farmland, quiet country roads, and the Nooksack River winding its way through the area. In the late 1980s, life here still moved at a gentle, familiar pace. People went to work, attended school, met one another at church or the local general store, and almost everyone knew exactly who lived in each house along the roads they traveled every day. Mandy Stavik, 18, was the daughter of the Stavik family, who lived in Deming. She had recently graduated from high school and begun her first year at Central Washington University. During her school years, Mandy was known as a well-rounded and energetic student. She competed in 3 different sports, spent her spare time teaching herself Japanese, and dreamed of becoming a commercial pilot one day. Over the Thanksgiving holiday in 1989, she returned home like so many first-year university students, looking forward to spending time with her family before heading back to campus. Her mother, Mary Stavik, was a woman all too familiar with heartbreak. 14 years earlier, her son Brent had died in an incident in Alaska that was never fully explained. Then, just 1 year before these events, her husband's stepson, Spencer, was killed in a boating accident, also in Alaska. Like many families in rural Washington, the Staviks carried quiet scars beneath the surface of what appeared to be an ordinary, peaceful life. Not far from the Stavik home, along the same road, lived another local resident, a man in his late 20s who had also grown up and worked around Whatcom County, just like so many other ordinary neighbors in that close-knit community. Acme and Deming in the late 1980s were the very picture of small-town rural America, places where people rarely bothered locking their doors, and where an unfamiliar ute driving past was enough to catch the attention of neighbors and become the topic of conversation before lunchtime. It was against this backdrop that everything was about to change. The afternoon of 24 November 1989 began like any other holiday. Thanksgiving still lingered throughout the Stavik home, the leftovers from the night before, the warmth of a family finally together, and the rare calm that comes with a long weekend. At around 1:50 p.m., Mandy got ready for her usual run. She pulled on her running shoes, changed into her exercise clothes, and clipped on the Walkman she always carried whenever she headed out. Beside her, Kira, the family's loyal German Shepherd, eagerly bounded ahead, following the familiar route they had traveled together countless times before. There was one small difference that day. Normally, Mandy's mother would ride alongside her on a bicycle for much of the route, but this time, she stayed home. Only Mandy and Kira set off down the quiet country road. The last member of the family to see Mandy alive was her brother. From a distance, he watched her running at her usual steady pace, looking completely relaxed, less than half a mile from home. Nothing about the moment seemed unusual. Nothing hinted that this would become the final image of his sister he would ever remember. Ahead of her, the road stretched past scattered homes across rural Whatcom County. Among them stood one particular house, whose occupant would not appear in investigators' files until nearly 3 decades later. But on that afternoon, neither Mandy nor anyone else had the slightest reason to feel uneasy. Time passed after she disappeared from her brother's view. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, then an hour. About 2 hours after Mandy had left the house, Kira returned alone. There was no sign of her owner. The dog, who had never left Mandy's side on their runs, crept onto the porch, trembling, refusing to look back towards the road from which she had come. Her tail was tucked tightly beneath her body, and she seemed terrified to go any further. It was the first moment genuine fear settled over the Starvik household. No one inside the house yet knew what had happened during those missing 2 hours along a road Mandy had traveled so many times before. The road ahead of Mandy was as quiet as any other late November afternoon. There was little traffic, and no unusual sounds carried to the nearby homes. In a community where people noticed every unfamiliar vehicle, that holiday afternoon passed without a single warning sign, as though the entire town was wrapped in the false peace of an ordinary Thanksgiving weekend. No one witnessed what happened next. There were no security cameras, no eyewitnesses, and no emergency call made during those 2 missing hours. There was only the stillness of rural Whatcom County, and a stretch of road that would keep its secret for nearly 3 decades. The only thing investigators were ultimately able to state with confidence, based on the prosecution's later findings, was that the peaceful afternoon ended in a horrifying chain of events. Mandy was overpowered along her familiar running route, less than half a mile from home, a distance that, under normal circumstances, would have taken only a few minutes to walk. He was taken away from the road, out of sight of anyone who might have helped her, and beyond the reach of a community that had always taken pride in knowing almost everything that happened around it. The Walkman she always carried on her runs, along with the exercise clothes she had been wearing when she left home, disappeared without a trace, as though they had never existed. Only her running shoes and socks remained on her when everything was over, the last silent reminders of that fateful afternoon. Then the Nooksack River, a place Mandy had passed almost every day as part of her regular running route, became the place where she was finally found, 3 days after leaving home. Throughout those 2 fateful hours, not a single person in the Acme community realized what was unfolding just a few hundred feet from their homes. For the next 28 years, that secret belonged to one person alone. As the afternoon faded into evening and Mandy still had not returned home, Mary Stavik began to feel a growing sense of dread. Kira's unusual return alone, frightened, and clearly distressed only made that feeling impossible to ignore. She immediately rang Mandy's boyfriend, the first person she thought of. He had no news. He hadn't seen Mandy since earlier that day. Mary then began calling friends and relatives, one after another, trying to think of anyone who might know where her daughter was. No one had seen Mandy since she set out for her afternoon run. As every simple explanation slipped away, Mary contacted the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. News of Mandy's disappearance spread quickly through the small community of Acme, where almost everyone knew one another. Within hours, dozens of local residents had joined the search, not only family and friends, but also people who had never even met Mandy, volunteering to help. In a community that took pride in knowing everything that happened around them, the sudden disappearance of a young woman was something no one could ignore. Deputies responded immediately, deploying search teams along with police dogs. Some officers searched on foot, while others patrolled on horseback, carefully combing every section of Mandy's regular running route. The first night passed without success, yet not one of the volunteers was willing to give up. Inside the Stavik family home, time seemed to stand still. Every sound outside the front door, every set of headlights sweeping across the yard, brought a moment of hope, only to end in disappointment when it was simply another volunteer returning to report that there was still no sign of Mandy. On the 3rd day of the search, as teams expanded their efforts beyond the area surrounding the Stavik family home, searchers reached the South Fork of the Nooksack River. It was there, in the icy waters of late November, that Mandy's body was found. As soon as the report came through, the first officers to arrive immediately secured the area, preventing anyone, including the volunteers who had been helping with the search, from approaching the scene. It was a standard procedure designed to preserve any evidence before it could be disturbed. One detail immediately raised serious concerns among investigators at the scene. Mandy was wearing only her running shoes and socks. The exercise clothes she had been wearing when she left home, along with the Walkman she always carried on her runs, were nowhere to be found. To experienced investigators, the unexplained absence of her clothing was a clear indication that this was far more than a simple running accident by the river. Detective Ron Peterson, the lead investigator on the case, arrived at the scene shortly afterwards. Only a few months earlier, he had completed specialized training at the FBI Academy in a field that was still relatively new to many local law enforcement agencies at the time: DNA analysis. Recognizing the importance of properly preserving biological evidence, he instructed the crime scene team to follow strict procedures when collecting, packaging, and storing every item that might contain traces left behind by the offender. The medical examiner's office was called to the scene soon afterwards to document the site and prepare for the post-mortem examination. Officers meticulously searched every centimeter of the surrounding area, looking for anything out of place: footprints, fibers, or any object that did not naturally belong along the riverbank. Based on what they observed at the scene, investigators began to believe they were dealing with something far more serious than a tragic running accident. A post-mortem examination was carried out shortly after Mandy's body was transferred to the Whatcom County Medical Examiner's office. This was a critical step in determining the exact cause and timing of her death, providing the foundation for every stage of the investigation that followed. The examination concluded that the cause of death was drowning. However, the manner of death was officially classified as undetermined, a finding of enormous significance because, from a legal standpoint, it left open the possibility that Mandy's death could have been the result of a tragic accident rather than a deliberate criminal act. That uncertainty placed the case in danger of never being formally classified as a homicide requiring a full criminal investigation, a reality that, even in hindsight, remains deeply unsettling. It highlighted just how fragile the line can be between a case that is pursued to justice and one that is quietly filed away, never to be solved. Alongside the post-mortem examination, forensic specialists collected biological evidence from Mandy's body in accordance with the strict procedures Detective Ron Peterson had insisted upon. During that process, they recovered a DNA sample belonging to an unknown male, which was carefully preserved. In 1989, DNA testing was still in its infancy within American law enforcement. No national DNA database yet existed that could compare the sample against the identity of a specific individual. In other words, investigators possessed a scientifically accurate genetic profile, but had no practical way of attaching it to a name. That DNA sample, together with the complete forensic file, was sealed and stored at the State Crime Laboratory, waiting for the day when advances in technology would finally allow it to speak on Mandy's behalf. With a DNA sample in hand but no database capable of identifying its owner, investigators were forced to rely on traditional police work, interviewing potential suspects, collecting statements, and systematically eliminating individuals based on the evidence available. The first person to come under scrutiny was Mandy's boyfriend. As is standard practice in homicide investigations, those closest to the victim are examined first. He cooperated fully with detectives, providing a detailed account of his movements on the day Mandy disappeared. After investigators verified his alibi, he was eliminated from the inquiry. Detectives then turned their attention to a drifter who was often seen around the area, the kind of individual who naturally attracted suspicion in a small community where everyone recognized one another. His DNA was compared against the biological evidence recovered in the case, but the results did not match. Another individual soon drew investigators' attention, a neighbor who lived nearby and repeatedly approached officers to ask about the progress of the investigation. To experienced detectives, such behavior could sometimes warrant closer scrutiny. The man initially refused to provide a voluntary DNA sample, forcing investigators to obtain a court order before collecting one. The comparison again produced no match. At the same time, the Pacific Northwest was gripped by a series of murders committed by an unidentified serial killer who would later become known as the Green River Killer. Because of the geographical proximity and the fact that bodies had been left near rivers, detectives from Whatcom County consulted the task force leading that investigation. After comparing victim profiles and crime scene characteristics, they concluded that Mandy's case was unrelated. With no viable suspects remaining and no technology advanced enough to further exploit the DNA evidence, the investigation gradually became a cold case. For more than 2 decades, new leads were scarce, phone calls became infrequent, and fewer people continued actively pursuing the mystery. The turning point finally came in 2013. At a local water park, 2 women, Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, both of whom had attended high school with Mandy, struck up a casual conversation. During that discussion, they made a remarkable discovery. For years, both of them had privately suspected the same man, Tim Bass, who had lived along the very road Mandy used for her regular runs. Detective Kevin Bohe, who had taken over the investigation in 2009, treated the information as a significant new lead. He organized a large-scale DNA collection effort known internally as a DNA sweep, gathering samples from dozens of men who had lived in the area in 1989. When his turn came, Tim Bass refused to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. Bass's refusal to provide a voluntary DNA sample did not bring the investigation to a halt. Instead, detectives launched a discreet surveillance operation, hoping to recover his DNA from items he discarded during his everyday routine. But Bass proved to be unusually cautious. He did not smoke in public, routinely wore gloves while working, and took home almost every personal item that might contain biological evidence, from drinking cups to used tissues. Weeks of surveillance passed without investigators obtaining a usable sample. Detectives then adopted a different strategy. They contacted Fran's bakery, where Bass was employed, and spoke with his direct supervisor, Kim Wagner, asking her to quietly observe his daily routine at work. For the following weeks, Wagner discreetly watched for an opportunity. Then, one afternoon, the break investigators had been waiting for finally arrived. Bass drank from a plastic cup, followed it with a can of Coca-Cola, and discarded both items into a rubbish bin in the staff break room. Without hesitation, Wagner retrieved the cup and the can, and immediately turned them over to investigators. The items were sent to the State Crime Laboratory for analysis. The results were decisive. The DNA recovered from the plastic cup and the soft drink can match the DNA profile preserved from Mandy's body 28 years earlier, with a random match probability of approximately 1 in 11 quadrillion. Armed with that evidence, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office moved swiftly. In late 2017, Timothy Forrest Bass, then 50 years old, was arrested in the car park of Fran's Bakery, where he had continued reporting to work every day for years. He was formally charged with murder, kidnapping, and rape. The handcuffs were fastened around his wrists at the very workplace where he had spent countless ordinary shifts alongside colleagues who had no idea he had been carrying such a devastating secret for nearly 3 decades. The interview began shortly after Bass was taken to the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. Detectives opened with the most basic question: did he know Mandy Stavik? Bass said no. He insisted he had never met her and had never spoken to her, a claim that stood in stark contrast to the fact that the two had lived along the same road for years. Rather than immediately challenging his account or increasing the pressure, investigators allowed Bass to maintain his denial while carefully observing his reactions and body language throughout the interview. It was a common interrogation strategy, giving the suspect psychological space before introducing the evidence that could not be explained away. At the appropriate moment, detectives told him directly that the DNA recovered from his plastic cup and Coca-Cola can match the DNA profile collected from Mandy Stavik's body 28 years earlier. Bass's response became one of the most striking moments of the entire case. He did not dispute the DNA results. He did not demand that the testing be repeated, nor did he react with the shock or outrage often expected from someone claiming complete innocence. Instead, he asked investigators a single question: how did you get my DNA? To experienced detectives, that question carried far more significance than it appeared to on the surface. A person with no connection to the crime would typically focus on proving their innocence or questioning the reliability of the forensic evidence. Bass, however, seemed concerned only with how investigators had obtained his DNA rather than whether the scientific findings were accurate. Throughout the remainder of the interview, Bass made no direct confession, nor did he offer any explanation about his relationship, if any, with Mandy Stavik. That explanation would come much later, not in the interview room, but months afterwards inside the courtroom itself. Before the case was formally brought to trial, Prosecutor David McEachran and the investigative team worked to strengthen every aspect of the prosecution's case, assembling a body of evidence capable of convincing a jury beyond reasonable doubt. One of the prosecution's key objectives was to establish that Mandy Stavik and Tim Bass had no personal relationship whatsoever. McEachran called numerous witnesses, including members of the Stavik family and Mandy's close friends, to confirm that, despite living on the same road for years, the two had never been known to each other, had never been seen together, and shared no mutual friends. From a forensic standpoint, the prosecution called the medical examiner who had conducted Mandy's post-mortem examination in 1989 to testify. He reaffirmed his original findings, stating that the biological evidence indicated sexual intercourse had occurred very close to the time of Mandy's death. His testimony became a crucial part of the prosecution's effort to rebut the defense's claim that Bass and Mandy had been involved in a secret romantic relationship for months before her death. In addition to the scientific evidence, prosecutors introduced testimony from witnesses whose accounts, while indirect, carried significant weight. Bass's former wife described a conversation they had while watching a television program about cold cases. According to her testimony, Bass remarked that he would never be caught because he was smart enough not to make mistakes, adding that avoiding law enforcement was, in his view, easy. Another important witness was Bass's own brother. He testified that Bass had once asked him to lie to police in order to provide a false alibi for the time of Mandy's disappearance. Taken together, the DNA evidence, testimony establishing that Bass and Mandy had no known relationship, the medical examiner's conclusions regarding the timing of the sexual activity, And the damaging statements from members of Bass's own family gave prosecutors confidence that they had assembled a case strong enough to present before a jury. Timothy Forrest Bass stood trial in the Whatcom County Superior Court, nearly 30 years after Mandy Stavic's death. For many local residents who had grown up with the mystery of her unsolved case, the proceedings represented far more than an ordinary criminal trial. They were the community's long-awaited opportunity to finally obtain an official answer to a case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. During the trial, Bass's defense team sought to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. One defense witness testified that he had seen a suspicious man sitting in a station wagon near the area around the time of Mandy's disappearance. The defense also called a former detective involved in the original investigation, who confirmed that police had investigated at least 3 other suspects before each was eliminated after DNA testing failed to match the biological evidence. The defense used this testimony to suggest that another unidentified offender might still exist. However, the defense arguments were unable to overcome the weight of the forensic evidence and the carefully supported witness testimony presented by the prosecution. After deliberating for less than a day, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, finding Bass guilty on all charges, including murder, kidnapping, and rape. For the Stavic family, especially Mandy's mother, Mary Stavic, who had waited nearly 3 decades for answers, the verdict brought an end to an agonizing chapter marked by years of unanswered questions. Many members of the local community, including people who had participated in the search for Mandy in 1989, also expressed a sense of relief that the case had finally been resolved. Public reaction to the verdict was overwhelmingly supportive, particularly in light of the DNA evidence, whose statistical probability of a random match was virtually impossible. Even so, some observers continued to question the reliability of the witnesses called by the defense, as well as the extraordinary length of time it had taken for the case to reach court, issues that reflected the limitations of criminal investigations before modern DNA technology became widely available. Mary Stavic had learned to live with unimaginable loss long before Mandy's death. 14 years earlier, her son, Brent, disappeared and was murdered in Alaska, a case that remains unsolved to this day. Then, just 1 year before Mandy was killed, she lost her stepson, Spencer, in a boating accident, also in Alaska. Then came Mandy. This time, the answers did not arrive after a few months, or even a few years. They came only after 28 years of waiting in silence. What makes this story so haunting is not only the length of that wait, but also an extraordinary coincidence. News of the killer's arrest arrived on Mary's 81st birthday. Bass was sentenced to life imprisonment. But can decades behind bars ever make up for the 28 years a mother spent living with unanswered questions? What do you think? Do you believe justice was truly served in this case? Is there anything about the investigation or the trial that still leaves you wondering? For 28 years, the killer was never hiding in some distant place. He lived on the very same road, went to work each day, married, raised a family, and built what appeared to be an ordinary life in the community. No one who greeted him in passing, worked alongside him, or shared community gatherings with him had any idea what he had concealed for nearly 3 decades. Perhaps that is the most disturbing part of this story, not the darkness lurking in some remote place, but the darkness that existed in plain sight, behind one of the most familiar faces in town. 2 women had privately suspected Bass years earlier. Yet both chose to remain silent out of fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that, in a small community, falsely accusing someone could destroy the accuser's own life. That silence lasted for many more years, and no one can say with certainty whether it delayed justice. The Mandy Stavic case was not solved by a single dramatic breakthrough. It was solved through decades of quiet persistence. A detective who carefully preserved a DNA sample at a time when few believed it would ever prove useful. A workplace manager who recognized the importance of a discarded plastic cup, and a family that never stopped waiting, even after hope had almost disappeared. Justice does not always arrive when we want it to, but as this case reminds us, it can still prevail so long as the evidence is preserved, and no one truly gives up.